Welcome. Hi. I just had a few minutes and I thought I would talk, teach, babble on about, go over this idea. This is something that I learned through teaching and perhaps learned unexpectedly. So I'm really grateful for this lesson. It's one of those lessons that kind of revealed itself, like a paleontologist may find a bone, archaeologists may find a shard of pottery as the winds of change and erosion reveal something. So I don't remember this as a lesson that was overtly offered to me or like I read in a book. It was more over a bunch of years of teaching and a lot of opportunities to teach and revise my teaching and learn from it and learn from my students, that this lesson came to me in a coherent way, and I've since offered it many, many times and probably sharpened my ability to deliver it, which is belied by the fact that I've talked for 90 seconds and not said anything. Anyway, I don't think I've taught it to the camera before. It's much easier, I think, for me to teach a person with this because the examples I use and the order of the curriculum, I guess, surrounding this central lesson changes depending on where they're from and the questions that they ask and how they respond to the initial lesson. So doing it to the camera feels at least awkward, if not a bit of a challenge for me, but I feel like it's worth it. So this is one of those things that people will come to me from various different places, scenario situations, backgrounds, educations, and so forth. And I kind of feel like the spoke that they travel to me when this lesson, will be coming out. I kind of feel like all these different spokes arrive at the same hub, at the same central lesson. And so I kind of see it as, I know you're coming way from over there, and just yesterday somebody came from way over here, but they kind of arrived at the same lesson, or for me, the same insight that this is the appropriate lesson for them. And as I've said, I might deliver it a bit differently depending on the person and the situation, but the central lesson remains. So anyway, here it is. It's about teaching. I've very often been in the situation, having been teaching for I don't know, 3.5 decades or whatever it's been, I don't know, where somebody will come to me and say, my sister's in town this week, and you remember that lesson you gave me that helped me quit smoking? If I can bring her by, can you give her that lesson? Like she's only here for the weekend and she really needs it. She has the same problems as me with addiction, for example. Somebody else will say, if you could just talk to my friend, he's in a really bad way, and I remember that metaphor you gave me, or that breathing technique, or that parable, or the way that you delivered that Qigong set, really helped me ameliorate my PTSD, helped me be relieved of my road rage for all these years, helped me really release my grief and come to a place of health regarding my situation. So those are all just a bunch of examples. Now I hear that, and a couple of things happen. One, oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, oh my God, I love that lesson. Yeah, I can't wait to give that lesson again. And part of me, maybe a bigger part, is the ego that's saying, oh yeah, that's right. I did that lesson in my inimitable way, in my well-honed, perfectly attuned, deeply resonant, very wise way. And so, I'd like to share my sagacity. Sure, bring your friend by, bring your mother by, bring your wife by, bring your kid by. I'd love to give that to them. And so that's my ego saying, oh yeah, it was all me, or the special teachings I have access to, or my insights about the arts. Sometimes it's not me, it's really them saying that Tai Chi Chuan lesson, I'd love for you to give it to them, it really worked for me. But more often, it's something about the way that I said it, the way that I gave that lesson, the thing that I showed, the drill I offered, whatever. So one of the things that got in the way of my learning this lesson that I'm working my way towards explaining was that ego. Like, whoa, somebody values what I do, and I love that lesson, and you're telling me how great it was, like life-changing and healing and insightful, and of course, and not even from an avaricious place, like, yeah, bring them by, I'll charge them for a lesson and do that lesson that I love that you're already excited about because it works. So it's not just, get me another student, because a lot of times these are kind of cases where, I've been studying for 10 years and that one class you showed me that thing, about living with anxiety, and it's really shifted my ability to sleep and get along with my boss or whatever. I'd love for you to talk to my cousin about that. I'm going to bring him in tomorrow. It's really easy for me to say, yeah, let me do that. And I've done it, sure, bring them by. It's like a 3-minute lesson. I'll show them. And that's the magic bullet. That's the fix everything. That's the master key. And since I'm so smart and wise and great and accomplished and skillful, I'll just deliver it to them free of charge. It's your sister, happy to help. We know it's changed your life for the better. So the problem, right, is that when that lesson was delivered, the drill, the breathing, the qigong, the metaphor, the wisdom story, the sort of dharma talk, if you will, when it was delivered to you, it was delivered within the context of a teacher-student relationship. You've already been studying with me, whatever, maybe Aikido, maybe Neizha Chuan, maybe Yi Chuan, whatever, Kung Fu student, whatever it might have been. And we already have this dynamic where you will tend to believe what I say and then give it a try. And often that's kind of required. Like you want to give it enough of a try to start to bear fruit. And you might not do that if you don't start with some credence for the teacher. Of course, a whole nother lesson, a whole different lesson there is, I want to be worthy of that trust. But the lessons occur within the context of a relationship, teacher-student. There's a trust there. There is a perspective, a viewpoint of the teacher that the student takes, which is something like this. There is an imbalance there, which again, there's a whole lot of reasons to pay attention to that and, be worthy of that relative imbalance and not bring harm to anybody, for example, and not violate trust and all that. That's not what this lesson is. So we have this relationship because you've been doing, stretching and Qigong with me for 2 years or 4 months or 22 years or whatever. And then you open up to me about smoking, and I say, well, here's a lesson that I've learned, and here's a way to look at it, and here's what the Tao Te Ching says, and here's something I learned from my teacher when I was in Japan, and and here's why we do the standing that way. So let me show you that stance again and talk about that. And then maybe you go home and you quit cigarettes, and you're cancer free in your lungs or whatever. So you're happy. The context within which you received that lesson was exceedingly important to your receiving the lesson. You believing it, you being open to hearing it, you trusting in it enough, not blind trust, but enough to give it a go. And it's not as simple as I had this secret answer, I had this treasure, I had the one true bit of wisdom, and I gave it to you because I'm a benevolent teacher and you asked. It's not that. it's hopefully the wisdom itself, let's say objectively, is some good stuff. Like that is a good stretch. That is a good self-massage sequence. That is a healthful standing protocol to do. That is a great old story from the Buddhist sages. Like great, But somebody's willingness to receive it, somebody's ability to hear it, somebody's credence given to it is a big part of it. So it isn't that this objective lesson can just land somewhere else. It's that this objective lesson, which here we're presuming is healthful and wise and good, arrives within a subjective context, which again we've said we hope is, or can assume here, is healthful, wise, kind, considerate, and so forth. And so this is exactly why somebody will say, remember that super short thing that you said that turned my whole life around? It was like this one sentence that was, perfectly honed. Then my ego says, yeah, perfectly honed. I did that honing and I chose just the right words, and I've taught that lesson for so many years and I have it polished down to just the absolute perfect thing. And I just said it to you, 4 years ago? And then your whole life has changed, right? Okay, so, oh man, I'm excited, right? There's my ego. Then they say, there's just this tiny little thing. You don't even need a whole lesson. But if I bring my sister by, could you just tell her that? And yeah, I really want to. That sounds great. If your sister comes by and I say, hey, good to meet you, Rachel. Here's this little lesson. That doesn't come with any sort of subjective relationship. I'm just the guy that her brother said is really great or really smart or good teacher or whatever. And I'm just purveying something. I'm offering something that's not supported by the context of the relationship. My ego is frustrated then, right? Like I want it to be this perfect silver bullet. I have the right answer and I'm freely giving it to you, but that's simply not the case. Part of how it works is that we had this relationship, which often takes work and time and energy and money to build, but that's why it landed. Or in part why it landed. And so the thing that I've learned is to say no to somebody who says, my sister's in a really bad way with heroin, and if you could just talk to her, that thing you said to me that really helped with my addiction is exactly what she needs, because she's at risk of losing her life now. She's already lost her family and her job and her car or whatever. I mean, man, I want to offer it, and I also want to be the one that has the answer. But the truth is, the realization that I had is that there is no context for that. I'll just be another voice in the storm. No particular reason to believe me. And let's assume here that I'm perfectly sincere and I do have some good insight information, insight, information. It doesn't really matter. It's not coming from a place of authority. It's not coming from a place of... it's not coming from a place where that person is ready to look for or believe the answers are. So this is a really tough lesson for me, right? Really, really tough. But it extends to conflict resolution or de-escalation, like what we call verbal judo after the book. It's very easy for me to have the right answer about something. Like, for example, in a social setting, the right answer. I've studied this. I know this. I have the science, or I saw, whatever, the TED Talk that Oprah gave about this, or my teacher told me, or I've been in this field forever long. It's very easy for me, particularly in a social setting, here in this example, some stranger, it's very easy for me to say, well, I know best, I know better, I know the right answer, I know a great way to say it, I know a perfect example to illustrate, to rock somebody's world and shift their worldview. Very unlikely that I'm going to be perceived as the source of an answer. It's very unlikely that I'm going to be perceived as the expert, as somebody worth somebody listening to well, somebody listening to fully, somebody trusting enough to stick with what they did listen to until it bears fruit. It's very, very unlikely. Essentially, little to no credibility with a stranger. Even to the point that if I showed up with all my credentials, I might not even have the credibility for them to feel like this person on the face of it seems worth the time to investigate the credentials, which would then perhaps lead me to an acceptance of the subjective relationship, which would allow me to receive the objective information, the lesson, the insight. So I've learned now when people say this, that, okay, my ego is going to go on its trip. Oh, come on, Steve, you've been teaching it for even longer now than the last time you considered this. You're even better at it. It's helped even more people. You are the one true reservoir of the deep wisdom. You know, my ego saying that, like, just take the call, you know, fix the person, heroin's tough, or suicide's tough. You can, and I have to say, well, until I have the context or the relationship with this person in which they might be able or likely willing to really hear me and perhaps put something into action, it's not going to do any good. It's really just going to feed my ego to do that. And so one of the ways that I sort of picture this lesson is if somebody said to me, I'd love for you to, talk about the basics of self-defense. You know, so I'm trying to think of something fairly broad. You know, I'd love for you to come on my TV show and talk about the basics of self-defense. To me, as a sort of expert in that field, you know, that's pretty broad. Like there's a lot to the basics, right? And I look at what am I being invited to? Well, I'm invited onto the local news channel where they have this little 4.5-minute segment in which 4 different, you know, talking heads will talk, and plus the 2 hosts or 1 host or something like that, and they're gonna have different viewpoints and maybe argue and get cut off and then a commercial break or whatever. My ego is like, oh, I'm gonna be on TV. Oh, they asked me, that's great because I'm smart, I know this, I'm an expert, I have a black belt and all this kind of stuff. That's the ego. And of course, I already feel like I have the right answers. So finally, you guys asked me, I'm coming on TV. And now I'm already thinking about what I'm going to wear, you know, and who I should tell, you know, watch me on TV tonight. Instead, what I do is say, wait a minute, what's the appropriate forum to fairly get this across? And at least as far as I can tell, the appropriate forum to get across a fairly involved, not just sort of simple black and white, and fairly broad topic, which I've suggested here was general self-defense intro stuff, but it could be something else, right? That's not the appropriate forum, or it certainly isn't one that I understand how to use to get across that information, even assuming that I have that information. And so it's better to turn that down and say, you're not inviting me to a context in which this wisdom can be received. Maybe the appropriate the appropriate context is a book or a series of books, or like a lifetime of teaching, right? You know, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. But I can recognize that the ego said, oh, TV, fame, expert on TV, you know, like that's a subject I know, let me get on there. And then of course, once you're on there, you find yourself arguing and then cut off for a commercial, and then maybe not being used to the medium, so I don't even talk well the way I might, you know, with my students or something. And so recognizing that the teaching is its own thing. We want to have that polished and understood, and have some skill at sharing it and understanding of it, depth and breadth, and, you know, polishing the material and access to the material and studying the material. Okay, so that's all great. But then that material needs a context within which it can best be shared. And that context is often a relationship. It might be like a scenario, like we described the TV, but that's a relationship too, a fairly brief one. I have a relationship to the viewers and the people in the studio that's, you know, certainly short term. Why would they listen to me? And can I get my point across in that situation? I've often had students ask me a pretty involved, like a question that has a pretty involved answer right at the end of class. And I'll say, ask me again next time early in the class, or email it to me and I'll try and address it, by writing it out, or that email serves as a reminder to me. But I want immediately, I have a whole thing on this. Let me give you the whole thing. But I can't do it justice here because of this amount of time. And so the lesson here then, in short, 20 minutes later, is to recognize that the lesson is served by the context in which the lesson will be shared. And that context will tend to be subjective, and have to do with relationships, maybe relationships to time, relationships to people, and so forth. So anyway, think about that next time when you're outside and you want to tell somebody how to behave, because you know better, because you read the study and you work in that field, and you heard something from your mom who's works in that field, and now you want to tell them. You're very likely initiating a conflict. That doesn't mean it becomes a physical conflict or deadly conflict or anything, but it's initiating a conflict because you believe that you can teach something in that moment, and recognize that you're very unlikely to have the relationship subjective context for offering the teaching. And so then to the other person, how would you be received, right? Are you going to be received as somebody who is meddling or interfering or imposing or arguing for, which can all feel like some level of aggression? And so anyway, that's kind of my whole lesson. I don't think there's another part I wanted to say. I don't know. Usually I'd say any questions, but we're taping it, so I see no questions. Thank you all very much.